We've got less than 1 week before the U.S. election kicks off, and everyone is talking about all of the various swing states that may decide the U.S. presidential election. But nobody is really talking about the single congressional district in Nebraska that may also prove crucial to the election, except for us. Denise Powell is the co-founder of Women Who Run Nebraska, and she is a local Democrat in Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. And Denise joins the podcast to talk about why this one district in Nebraska may end up deciding the presidential election, despite the fact that Nebraska is a solidly red state. We also talk about what voters in Nebraska care about and how Democrats can win in states like Nebraska. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to like, subscribe to the podcast, leave a comment, all of that is appreciated. And if you want to get involved even more, you can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org. If you want to promote liberal center-left politics in America, if you want to join a local chapter, if you just want to show your support for the podcast, please consider joining us. We would love to have you. As always, thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Denise Powell. Denise, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So this is an interesting episode because this is really, we're kind of focusing in on one specific congressional district, one specific area of one specific state, but it could end up having really, really outsized importance in the national election, the presidential election that we have coming up. What can you tell people who don't know about the way Nebraska does elections? Why is Nebraska unique, and what makes it potentially so important this election?
Oh, well, this is my absolute favorite topic to discuss, so thank you. And to frame this, I want to say that I am originally from Florida. I lived in New York, I lived in Los Angeles, and I moved to Omaha, Nebraska, just over 15 years ago. And this place and this state, they're extremely unique and special. And I know everybody thinks that their state is the specialist, but I would argue that Nebraska is a really amazing and unique place. And part of what makes us really interesting is that the state has a total of 5 electoral votes, but we are not a winner-take-all state. We're one of only 2 states, the other one being Maine, that allocates our electoral votes by the winner of each congressional district instead of winner-take-all. In Nebraska, we have 3 congressional districts. 2 of them are predominantly right-leaning, Republican-leaning, and one of them, Congressional District 2, has really become Democratic-leaning. And that means that in 2008, we delivered what we lovingly call the blue dot for President Obama. And then again, in 2020, we delivered the blue dot for President Biden. And we're really hopeful that perhaps this year, in 2024, we will deliver another blue dot for Kamala Harris.
So it really does seem like a swing district in that it went for Obama in 2008 because that was a very, very blue year in 2008. But then in 2012, 2016, did not find itself in the Democratic column. So it really can swing back and forth here, this kind of one district that we're talking about.
That's correct. And part of that is in terms of geography, Congressional District 2 includes all of Douglas County, which includes Omaha. And Omaha is our state's largest city by a long shot. It also includes Saunders County and areas of western Sarpy County, but that Omaha thing is critical. There are about 475,000 registered voters here. And this district, unlike the other districts in Nebraska, they are more reflective of our national electorate. So there really is a pretty even balance between Republicans and Democrats, which means that, it is a real winnable battle, I guess, from both sides. The other districts in the state tend to have, they are more predominantly Republican. And so sometimes those, districts do not feel like opportunities for Democratic candidates. but Congressional District 2 really does. And I think this year in particular, we've gotten some attention here because we know that this presidential election is going to be very, very close. And our one little blue dot here, our one electoral vote, could be a make or break, kind of situation for our candidates. So it's been really fun to have lots of attention here in Nebraska. We know here in Nebraska, and particularly in Omaha, that we, punch above our weight class. And I'm notorious for butchering sports metaphors. So hopefully you got the gist of what I'm trying to say. But we can do really interesting and big things here. The whole state is set up in a very interesting way as well. We are the only state in the union with unicameral. That's one house. We only have one house, and it's been this way since 1937. So we have 49 state senators who make all the big decisions here in our state. So really, as a state, we just have this very interesting way of governing. And that includes obviously the electoral vote and what we're able to do as a congressional district, but really as a whole state, Nebraska looks at things differently. And I think across the state, people here tend to have a more centrist bent. We're seeing that now there is a independent running for Congress, and our whole for Senate, and our whole federal delegation is Republican. And we have an independent who is running for Senate, who is doing really well. And all of the polling is showing, that he really has a shot of beating the Republican incumbent. We have a congressional candidate and CD2 that is running against incumbent Congressman Don Bacon, who is also polling really well and has a lot of popularity. And we've got others. In fact, Congressional District 1, which includes Lincoln, which is our state capital, has State Senator Carol Blood running for Congress against incumbent Congressman Mike Flood, former state senator, I should say. And that's another district where, there's a lot of potential here because the state is shifting. Things are changing, and I just think it's going to be a really interesting year to see what happens in a state like ours. And a little bit of a litmus test, perhaps, for other states like ours that tend to lean more to the right, but maybe are sort of leaning back toward the middle.
I think it's really interesting, the idea, what you said about Congressional District 2 specifically, that has Omaha in it. Congressional Districts 1 and 3 are pretty rural and pretty isolated in a lot of ways, the communities there. And, they are not exactly what America looks like, right? But, New York City, where I live, is also not what the average American household looks like either. And I like the idea of District 2 in Nebraska really being like a picture of normal America, in that, Omaha is not the biggest city in the world, but it is a pretty decently sized city, and it's got some important companies that headquarter there. It's got suburbs, it's got some rural areas. It's really kind of got a little bit of everything, and maybe it does encapsulate America in all of its diversity, I guess.
Yes and no. We're a city of about 500,000 people, and the whole state population is just under 2 million people. So Omaha itself represents a quarter of the state's population. But, it is not as diverse, and by that I mean ethnic and cultural diversity, as other cities are, but it is growing. That part of the state is growing. And in fact, there was a report recently that showed that in a lot of our rural communities out in CD3, the growth that is happening in those communities is solely from immigrants. So we're seeing a lot of immigrants coming in and building businesses and doing all kinds of really cool things in some of these communities. So even Congressional District 3, I think, is shifting to be more representative of the rest of the country. And I spend a lot of time out in rural communities and, of course, out in Omaha. I did a lot of work on various ballot issues that we are really excited to have on the ballot this November. And some of the best conversations that I had were at houses, that were a mile off the road flying a Trump flag, where, on the surface, we don't have a lot in common. But once we start talking about issues like protecting public schools and people's health and everything, there's a lot more commonality there. So I might challenge that notion that parts of Nebraska, like Congressional District 3, aren't necessarily reflective of the rest of the country, because I think there are a lot of people out there who don't live in an urban core, don't live in a major city, and in a way have seen themselves pushed out of the political conversation. And I think, we've had a history of doing that here in Nebraska, where we sort of write off Congressional District 3 because it's like, well, that's not winnable. But somebody needs to be out there talking to and listening to those folks. There are hardworking families out there who are literally feeding this nation with their farms and their businesses. And I think they merit having a voice. And
Yeah, I mean, everybody merits having a voice, obviously, but you miss an important part of America if you look at CD1 or CD3 in Nebraska, because you don't get that other important part of America, which is its cities. It's
absolutely,
engines of economic growth, and it's just interesting to me that the second district seems to have a little bit of everything, a little bit of every part.
it
But
does. It does.
but as you pointed out, there's some scenarios where this one electoral vote out of 538 could end up being really, really impactful. There's a specific scenario, where if you look at all the swing states, I believe it's, if Kamala Harris manages to win the traditional Midwestern kind of sweep of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, but then Donald Trump wins most of the traditional Sun Belt areas and southern areas. He takes North Carolina and Georgia, Arizona, etc. That you end up in pretty much a 269 to 269 tie, and the only thing that could swing it is one electoral vote from Nebraska. And so we find ourselves in this position where it could be really, really important what happens in Omaha, but there's actually been some drama this year about whether or not that was even going to continue to be the case.
That is very, very true. So I talked earlier about our unicameral and how we have one House with 49 senators. And our governor, Jim Pillen, was attempting to rally support for a special session to make Nebraska a winner take all state. We have a majority Republican body, and we have 16 Democrats and independents in our unicameral. And so, really, the votes came down to one person. And we had a senator who was formerly a Democrat who switched his party affiliation to Republican, but he is based here in Omaha, represents a good chunk of South Omaha. And I know that there was incredible pressure from all sides to push for that. There were a lot of people out here stumping and trying to pressure both the governor and all these senators to call this special session to push the state into winner take all. But that senator held fast in what he had agreed earlier in the year, and thankfully we have saved the blue dot for this year. Now, I think that this is an issue that might come up again in the future, in particular if Congressional District 2 does deliver that electoral vote. I think that is something that our state would very much like to see stopped. But again, Congressional District 2, it represents a quarter of the population of the whole state. So we would argue that that is a system that is truly representative of the people of the state.
In this particular case, it certainly looks like this is just a partisan effort. There's a Republican governor in Nebraska. There's a Republican-led state legislature. Like you said, it's just one body. It's not multiple bodies. But in this case, they're basically just very cynically making a move that would help the Republican presidential candidate, because Nebraska is pretty guaranteed at a statewide level to go for Donald Trump. That in this particular case, it's definitely very cynical, and it's motivated by partisanship. In a more generic sense, though, say they passed a bill that said, well, 20 years from now, we are going to switch it to a winner take all system. Is that something that you think you would support? Or do you think that the current system is actually just better, regardless of which party you're in, regardless of which district is going which way, that the current system is just the best way to do it?
I believe the current system is the best way to just do it. I think it is more representative of the popular vote and of what the people want. And I would absolutely argue to keep it the way it is. in now and in 20 years.
Yeah, because I mean, look, the current one is obviously just a cynical political ploy. Everybody should be against that, but there's kind of this interesting theory question of if theoretically which one is the best way. But it's an interesting way, and it's a quirk of history, I guess, that only two states in the union do it that way.
Yeah,
But
the whole electoral college, really, the whole concept of the electoral college feels very dated. And and we saw this come up in previous elections where a candidate won the popular vote, but the candidate who won the electoral vote moved forward. So I think the whole system needs reevaluation. And so that's why I'm such a believer in the way that we do it here. And I know that there are people who maybe don't understand why we wouldn't do it like 48 other states, but I just think our system makes more sense as it relates to, you know, putting the power back into the hands of the people.
well, let's talk about the people. Because obviously Nebraska is like anywhere else in America in that they care about big national issues. They're going to care about the economy. They're going to care about inflation and kind of these big topics, abortion, immigration. There's all this stuff that everybody cares about. But when we think about Nebraska specifically and Congressional District 2 specifically, how do politics in Nebraska operate differently than they do in other places? Are there specific issues that loom really large? Are there specific ways of just kind of doing political work that you have to think about when you're in Nebraska?
The big thing you have to think about when you're doing political work is not to schedule events during Husker games. And I only am being slightly facetious, but that is the big thing. The Huskers are life here, go Big Red. That is the big thing to think about. But no, I think it's just like anywhere else. Right now we have four really huge ballot issues that people have been working very, very hard to get on the ballot in November. They all qualified. And it's issues like medical cannabis. We're one of only 3 states that doesn't have access to medical cannabis. It's issues like abortion. We are the only state that has dueling abortion petitions, which is a very complicated thing. We have a ballot initiative to repeal a school voucher bill. Until this year, Nebraska had been able to stave off any attempts to divert public taxpayer money to private schools. And the legislature this year passed a bill that does just that. And so there is a ballot issue to help repeal Legislative Bill 1402. We also have paid sick leave on the ballot. So it's all the same things, that really just boil down to people wanting to thrive and to be able to have the economic stability that lets them and their families live. A big topic of conversation in Nebraska is always property taxes. Our property taxes are pretty high, and there really hasn't been a great effort to address that. There were some really impressive tax cuts that passed this year that we're really grateful for, but there is still more work to be done. But again, it's the same things that everybody cares about. It's access to healthcare. It's, quality, safe, affordable housing. It's solid public schools. We have wonderful public schools in this state, and we want to keep them that way. And then it's all those things that make people's lives easier, like infrastructure and paid sick leave and transportation, et cetera.
I'm very interested in the abortion ballot initiatives specifically because there was something interesting with one of your neighbors last year in Kansas. They had an abortion referendum or ballot initiative. I'm not sure what they call them in Kansas, but basically, Kansas is a very red state, always goes Republican and has for decades. And I think people kind of thought that, well, Kansas is going to be able to kind of ban abortion. They're very conservative, they're very red. That ended up not being the case. The pro choice side of it ended up winning actually pretty convincingly. I think it was something like 58-42 or something like that. It wasn't all that close. And this was kind of part of a series of victories for reproductive rights all across the country. In the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned. And so I guess I'm curious, like if you put your prognosticator hat on, if you had to look into the future, do you think that Nebraska will be doing the same thing? That there's a chance that despite being a red state, Nebraska could pass something that would protect abortion rights?
I do think we could. So we have a history, a very recent history of blocking some pretty terrible abortion bans in this state. There was an attempt to pass a trigger ban that when Roe fell, we would ban abortion completely in this state, and that failed in our state legislature. Then there was an attempt at a 6-week ban, and that failed in our legislature. Only recently did the state pass a 12-week ban, which is what we have today. Now, there was a ballot issue filed that made it onto the ballot that would protect abortion until fetal viability as defined by a physician and the patient. And so basically, it's bringing our policy back to Roe standards. There is a strategy that is being implemented by pro-life groups that they introduce a competing ballot issue. And unfortunately, this one made it onto the ballot as well, that would essentially enshrine our current ban into law, but leave some flexibility for the legislature to come back and enact an even more restrictive ban. And our governor himself has said that he wants Nebraska to be a totally pro-life state and ban abortion altogether. So it is really dangerous. And the danger with these competing ballot issues is that they confuse voters. The one is the very first issue that voters can vote for on their ballot, and the other one is the very last issue voters can vote for on their ballot. So we've been doing a lot of education about what these two initiatives mean and which one you should vote for and which one you shouldn't vote for. But even the advertising that the opposition is using makes it very clear that they understand that Nebraskans do not want doctors interfering in their personal health decisions. So they have advertising that makes it sound like the Protect Our Rights ballot issue, which is the one that's trying to protect the fundamental right to abortion, is infringing on a person's right to make decisions with their doctors. So in my mind, what that tells me is that they know, and the statistics show, that this is no longer a popular issue with women. The fall of Roe made it very, very real for a lot of women. And I think that we all sort of lived in this world where we felt protected by Roe. And when Roe fell, suddenly we realized that it was a danger to women everywhere. So I think that it is very real that Nebraska can follow, suit like what Kansas did and what other states are doing. I think there are a lot of states that have abortion on the ballot this year. We're proud to be one of them. And if we can just educate people about the difference on these two ballot issues, I think we'll be successful.
What are the other races that you're looking at this year? Because we're obviously been talking about the presidential race, and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are both battling for the one electoral vote out of Omaha. But you've mentioned a couple other races as well that could end up having national significance. The race for the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives are expected to potentially be very close. So what else are you looking at?
Aside from the House of Representatives and Senate, so the way our
Also those, I think.
also those. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So first, we have some fantastic congressional candidates here in Congressional District 2. Tony Vargas is running against the incumbent, Congressman Don Bacon. Tony is the son of immigrants, a former middle school science teacher who served both on the Omaha School Board and the state legislature, representing a big chunk of South Omaha. And he's amazing. He would be the first Latino to ever represent Nebraska in our federal delegation, which would be a huge, huge win for the state, especially as the state's population continues to shift that way. We have a big Latino population, of which I am part. So it would be a very exciting change based on what we have now. And his polling is showing that he's got a real shot at defeating Congressman Bacon. The other race that's very exciting is a race for Senate. And there's an incumbent named Deb Fisher, who's our current senator, and she is running against an independent named Dan Osborne, who's a mechanic, union guy. He led the Kellogg's workers' strike when they were, fighting for better wages. Just a real non-traditional candidate. And I think he's really appealing to people who are just looking for something more real and more authentic. And so that's been really exciting to watch, as well as, this is a statewide race, so he has to appeal not just to progressives, but also to conservative voters and to everyone in between. So it's been very interesting to watch that race, and I'm very excited to see what happens there. There are two other candidates, another congressional candidate, Senator Carol Blood, who is another state senator who served on the Bellevue City Council. She is running for Congressional District 1, And Carol has done a fantastic job campaigning and just getting out there. She's a real hard worker, and that's been really great to watch. And again, as Congressional District 1, which encompasses Lincoln, our state capital, but also some very rural areas, it'll be interesting to see how voters there show up at the polls. Also in Omaha, there's another Senate candidate, Preston Love, who's just a fabulous civil rights leader here, who's running against Pete Ricketts, who's our former governor, now senator. Two very, very different human beings. So we're pretty excited about that. And our funny little unicameral that has 49 seats, half of the unicameral is up for reelection or election this year. So we're tracking 24 races. And there are a lot of really interesting candidates, a lot of independents, a lot of moderate Republicans, a lot of Democrats. And it'll be very interesting to see how all the top of the ballot energy trickles down to these down ballot races this year.
Have you had much of the kind of national political scene coming into Omaha, like flying in and introducing themselves, so to speak? I'm curious how much attention you've been getting this year as opposed to previous years.
We have been getting so much attention, which is it's very exciting because for years when we were doing this work and trying to convince people that we had a really special story here, that there was something interesting happening in the state, Nebraska was never going to be at the top of anybody's priority list. But now we are. Had a lot of attention from folks. We get a lot of people coming into the state to stump for different candidates. We have Gwen Walls coming in this weekend for the Nebraska Democratic Party event and doing some events with kids. We've had Congresswoman Catherine Clark in yesterday stumping for Tony Vargas, and certainly national groups who are investing money into this district on both sides of the equation, which is good and bad. It's going to be a record-setting year, and 2022 was actually a record-setting campaign finance year in Nebraska. All of these races are getting more expensive, and we are at the point in the cycle where they are getting uglier. So we're seeing a lot more negative ads, a lot more negative mailers, and from organizations that never played in this state before, and new organizations that have been propped up just to sort of take advantage of the energy here in Congressional District 2. So it's been a little bit surreal and sometimes a lot to manage. But again, I'm certainly, as somebody who's been doing this for a while now and, desperately trying to raise money for great candidates and great activities, it is appreciated that people finally see the opportunity that especially Congressional too, but Nebraska as a whole presents to the bigger picture.
I was going to say, don't celebrate all those political ads too quickly, because one of the great benefits of not being in a swing state is that you never have to see political ads when the presidential season rolls around.
Ugh, I know. I can't wait for November 6th so that I don't have to watch another one of those terrible, terrible ads.
I know, but I mean, like you said, it comes with some good stuff and some bad stuff. It's good to have these conversations. It may even be a little bit good for the local economy if people are, really pumping money into advertising in the local area. It could be a little shadow benefit there. But so I'm going to ask you to kind of play magic 8 ball predictor one more time here. I'm curious if you think that, there's some of these victories that we've been talking about might be a little bit more likely than others. And by that I mean, it would be great to kind of have a blue sweep and, medical marijuana passes and abortion is protected and, we win the Senate seat or the independent wins the Senate seat and we win the congressional race in in Congressional District 2 and we get the electoral vote there and we just have this great blue wave as much as you can have a blue wave in Nebraska, right? You
Yes.
could also see there's just a red wave. Maybe Donald Trump is way stronger than everybody thinks, and there's a big red wave across the country. But in the case, like, let's imagine that some of these things pass, some of these win, and some of them don't. What do you think is the most likely to kind of pass or give us a victory, even in the case where we don't win everything? And what do you think we might lose, even if we have a good year?
That is a great question. And I will couch this by saying that I am an optimist. I think when you work in politics, you have to be an optimist almost, to the point of delusion sometimes to keep putting one foot in front of the other. But I do feel
You are
cautious.
a Democrat working in Nebraska. I
Exactly.
fully believe in your optimism.
Yes, and I do, and I feel very optimistic. I have cautious optimism that Congressional District 2 will deliver the blue dot for Vice President Harris and, Tim Walz. I believe that Tony Vargas is going to pull it off this year. Tony ran a few years ago and came very, very close, but we are at a very different point as a state. So I think that Tony Vargas is going to pull off a win in Congressional District 2. And I think Dan Osborne could be a real dark horse that comes in and picks up that Senate seat. As it relates to the unicameral, I think that we are going to hold our filibuster. So we need 17 votes in order to filibuster bad legislation. And right now we are at 16. So we need to pick up one more seat. And I think that we're actually going to do it this year. And for those ballot issues, Nebraskans are very, very passionate about public schools. We have 93 counties in the state, and more than 60 of those counties don't have private schools. And so I think that the repeal of that voucher bill is going to happen. And medical cannabis has been extremely popular. I circulated lots and lots of those petitions, and I had people from all walks of life and all parties who wanted to sign the medical cannabis petition because everybody has somebody that they know who could benefit from it, whether they're dealing with cancer or PTSD or children with seizure disorders or whatever it is. Paid sick leave was immensely popular when we were out canvassing. And I think, again, if we can manage to plow through all of the confusion that the dueling abortion initiatives are are creating, I think we could win that too. So in my mind, this is a huge, huge year for our state, not only because, we can do big things at the top of the ballot. And I think that obviously the presidential race is critical to the health and well-being of this whole country. But as a state, I think there are going to be some big, big changes in here that are going to make people's lives better and that are going to make it harder for people to pass bad, harmful legislation that is being dictated by national political agendas. And, Nebraska is not unique to that. I mean, we're not unique in that a lot of our statewide officials, our governor, our attorney general, they're really towing that, partisan party line in some of their decision making, as opposed to doing things that are right for the people of this state. So I'm very excited, and I think that this cycle presents such an opportunity for big change in this state. And hopefully that inspires other states that, shoot, if it's possible in a state like Nebraska, maybe it's possible somewhere else.
I really would love to get your thoughts though, just gun to your head, like which one of these do you feel really, really confident in? Which one would you, bet your house against? Whereas if I think about betting my house against one of these things, it would not be that other one. That one, it would take a really good year for us to get that one.
Sure, I would bet my house on the blue dot on Congressional District 2 going blue. I would bet my house on that. I feel very
That you feel
confident.
the state of the polling is good right there?
I do, and just the energy here is incredible. People are coming out of the woodwork to support and to show up. Um, I think we're going to do it. I think we're going to do it. I think Omaha is a changing city. It has changed so much in the 15 years that I've lived here. It is unrecognizable from the city it was 15 years ago, and I feel super confident that we're going to deliver that electoral vote.
All right. So we're nearing time, but I do have a few more questions I want to ask. These are traditional Nebraska questions. So who is, in your mind, the Nebraska Cornhuskers' biggest rival?
Oh my gosh! You know what? I'm going to say something so unpopular. Uh, the University of Miami is my alma mater, and I always root for the Huskers until they play the University of Miami. So I like to believe it is the University of Miami, but some might
Well,
say
back in the '90s when Nebraska was actually really, really good, Miami was a big thing.
it was. It was. That was my first Husker game here was the Huskers versus Miami, and I was wearing my Miami T-shirt. And the amount of people who said, "Hey, welcome to Nebraska, good game," because people here are genuinely nice, and I don't know that that would have happened had the roles been reversed and the Nebraskans would have been in Miami. But here, people were very nice and supportive. And by the way, we lost that game, so all the Husker fans felt really good after the game.
So I'm not going to ask you which state has the best corn because I know
Ugh,
you're going to say
duh.
Nebraska. Now,
Yeah.
but somebody in Iowa might say that it's Iowa. So if you were explaining to someone from Iowa why Nebraska has the best corn, what would you tell them?
Them's fighting words, Jeremiah. No, we have the best corn because it is just in our DNA. It isn't the DNA of the state. And when I moved here, I learned how to properly make corn. I think that's the other thing. It's not just the quality of the corn, but it's also the preparation of the corn, which is something I learned here. I don't know if you do this at home, but when you boil it, you're supposed to put sugar in it, which sugar in that water, something I didn't know until I moved to Nebraska. So there's a little tip for all your listeners.
There's a great debate that goes around, is Nebraska a Midwestern state or not?
How is that up for debate? Of course, we're a Midwestern state. We're as Midwestern as it gets. We are smack in the middle of the country. In fact, when I moved here from Los Angeles and friends were saying, "Where the heck are you moving?" I would say, "Put your finger in the middle of the map and then just scooch down one." And that's us. I mean, we're as Midwestern as it gets, and proudly so. It's a
It's
wonderful thing.
it's funny. It's funny that I feel like Nebraska people in Nebraska have that perception, but I looked at some. There's a map you can put out, and they did a poll of is this state Midwestern? And for it like Iowa and Wisconsin, and it's like almost 100%, and Nebraska was almost 50-50 in terms of not people from
Really?
Nebraska, but people nationally. Well, I think a lot of people think it's kind of like a Great Plains state. I don't
Sure,
know.
sure.
It,
I don't know. I think that Nebraskans are very proudly Midwestern. It's one of the things that I love. I love the Midwestern values here. Again, I grew up in Miami, Florida. Like, could not be a more different environment to grow up. And I had two children here, raising my kids with these Midwestern values. I absolutely love it.
and then the traditional question that we always end the podcast on, where can people go if they want to learn more about Nebraska or about Omaha, about the political system or the things that are important in Nebraska? If people are curious about all these things we've been talking about, what would you recommend for them? This could be, a book to read, somebody to follow on Twitter who talks about Nebraska politics. It could be a blog, a newspaper, anything that you think would be valuable for people who want to learn more about everything we're talking about here today.
There are a couple sources that I really love, some online news outlets. One is called Flatwater Free Press, and I believe the website is flatwaterfreepress.com. It has really interesting and well thought out stories on the state, both political stories, but also just fabulous introspective looks at, different things that are happening across the state. The other is nebraskaexaminer.com. It's another online news source. But they do a very, very good job, in particular with all the political stuff and weighing through the important issues. Those are two of my favorite news sites. Definitely our uh, Democratic chair here in the state, Jane Klebb, wrote a great book called Harvest the Vote, which is a really interesting look at, building coalitions in red parts of our state. And certainly you could visit our website, which is womenwhorunnE.org, to learn more about candidates that we're excited to support and some of the other work that we're doing.
All right. Well, I think we will all be waiting to see what happens in the second district come election night, and I certainly hope it goes the way that we've been talking about. I want to thank my guest one more time for coming on the show. Denise Powell, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.